is very similar to some of the things we saw in chapter 2. Well, actually, going all the way back to chapter 1, then in chapter 2, then in chapter 3. So this notion of how we suffer and how we deal with suffering is something we see all the way through 1 Peter. And of course, there in 1 Peter 5, even toward the end of that chapter, he'll be mentioning suffering that you'll notice there in verse 9. But resist him firm in your faith, knowing that the same experiences of suffering are being accomplished by your brethren who are in the world. And after you have suffered for a little while, the God of all grace, who called you to his eternal glory in Christ, will himself perfect, confirm, strengthen, and establish you. And that's even in the conclusion. We're getting into the conclusion of the book. So this is something Peter talks about a lot, because these Christians in a very particular way were suffering for the cause of Christ. But regardless of the nature of suffering, and there are several different ways we can suffer. We could suffer physically. We could suffer, psychologically or emotionally from abuse from a wicked society. But that's not a new thing. It's not a new idea. That has always been the case for God's people. And so these principles are very important for us. So we have some brethren in places in the world that actually suffer physically for their profession of faith. Maybe their houses are burned down, or they're put to death, or they're afflicted in some physical way. But because we're not going through that right now in this nation, I'm not saying it could never be the case, but it doesn't mean that there's not a type of suffering that Christians always go through. So these principles are very important regardless of our environment and circumstances. So what I have on this particular slide, this first slide I wanted you to notice, this is just a pretty fundamental breakdown of 1 Peter 4:12 through 19 in a very practical way, I think. And so we're going to read this, but we look at these particular principles that he presents and this admonition about our suffering. First of all, he's going to tell us, don't be surprised that you suffer for the cause of Christ. Don't be alarmed by that. We need to understand that that is going to happen. So don't be surprised by it. Number 2, keep on rejoicing, even though these circumstances are very difficult, because our joy is not based on our circumstances. Number 3, even in our suffering, see the blessing of God's presence in times of suffering. Keep relying on God. Don't give up regarding your trust or your confidence or your reliance on the Lord. And make sure you're suffering for the right reasons, though. Don't suffer because you're guilty of something. Suffer because you've been innocent in serving God. And then glorify God in your profession of faith and in who you are, your identity as a Christian. So that's my breakdown of that section. So let's read it together. 1 Peter chapter 4. Will, do you mind reading? 1 Peter chapter 4, and just read verses 12 through 19.
Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal among you, which comes upon you for your testing, as though some strange thing were happening to you. But to the degree that you share the sufferings of Christ, keep on rejoicing, so that also at the revelation of his glory you may rejoice with exultation. If you are reviled for the name of Christ, you are blessed, because the Spirit of glory of God rests on you. Make sure that none of you suffers as a murderer, or thief, or evildoer, or a troublesome meddler. But if anyone suffers as a Christian, he is not to be ashamed, but is to glorify God in his name. For it is time for judgment to begin with the household of God. And if it begins with us first, what will be the outcome for those who do not obey the gospel of God? And if it is with difficulty that the righteous is saved, what will become of the godless and the sinner? Therefore, those also who suffer according to the will of God shall entrust their souls to a faithful Creator in doing what is right.
Okay, very good. So let's talk through some of this. Verse 12 there, of course, he says, beloved, don't be surprised. And how does he describe the trial there? What phraseology does he use there in your fiery ordeal? Well, that reminds us of what previous chapter of 1 Peter. 1 Peter chapter 1. And so if you go back, and we won't just go through all this, but I just want you to see it. 1 Peter 1, when he talks about trials, this metaphor of fire, it being fire, is something we see throughout the New Testament, throughout Scripture. And in 1 Peter 1, he uses fire as an analogy of sorts. What is it in 1 Peter 1, 6 through 9 that he describes as a process and then says, hey, this is parallel to some degree, or at least applies from a spiritual standpoint to what trials do in your life? So when you look at 1 Peter 1, 6 through 9, do you remember what he talks, what's being developed in this fiery trial? It's a purification process. So, you have some element or ore that goes through this fire. What is it about the fire that actually purifies it, though? It's heat. So the intensity of the heat, the heat gets turned up. And what does the heat do? Well, it demands only those things that can actually preserve or last are going to survive. Anything deficient, anything short of that, what's going to happen? Well, it's going to fade away because it can't survive that kind of heat. Now, what happens after the process? Well, it's more valuable than it's ever been before. He even describes gold. And if you'll look there in 1 Peter 1, where he says, in this you greatly rejoice, even though now for a little while, verse 6, if necessary, you've been distressed by various trials, that the proof of your faith. Now, I want to do something. Who has let's see, English Standard Version in here? Okay, Austin. And then I need a New King James. Who's got New King James? Go ahead, okay. We're going to read 1 Peter 1, and I want to read let's do verses 6 and 7. 1 Peter 1, 6 and 7, okay? And then, Alan, you have the New American Standard Bible, don't you? Okay, so let's get these other translations all out there. So let's begin. Kimberly, I'll tell you what, start with yours.
In this you greatly rejoice, though now for a little while, if need be, you have been grieved by various trials, that genuineness of your faith, being much more precious than gold, and that perishes though it is tested by fire, may be found to praise, honor, and glory at the revelation of Jesus Christ, whom having not seen you love, though now you do not see him, yet believing you rejoice with joy inexpressible and full of glory.
Very good. Thank you. Okay, Austin, read from the ESV.
In this you rejoice, though now for a little while, if necessary, you've been grieved by various trials, so that the tested genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold that perishes, though it is tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. Okay,
Alan, there you do. So.
In this you greatly rejoice, even though now for a little while, if necessary, you have been distressed by many trials, that the fruits of your faith, being more precious than gold, which is perishable, even though tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ.
Okay, very good. Thank you. So the New American Standard Bible says proof. The New King James says what? Did y'all catch it? Genuineness. But the ESV, did y'all catch how it described it? Tested genuineness. Isn't that what it says? So all of those are good translations, but here's the thing. So the New American Standard Bible is saying, okay, the meaning of this is that you see the proof of your faith and how you go through this. Well, in what sense is it proof? And I think the New King James and especially the ESV is trying to get to the heart of that when it says tested genuineness. In other words, the trial is a test, and as you persevere under the trial, there's a fruit of that. And the fruit is we have proof. What's the proof? The tested genuineness of faith. If you don't turn the heat up, you don't get that kind of purification process or that development. So it reveals something. It also even renews us. 2 Corinthians 4:16 through 18 says trials even renew us. They actually make us stronger. And then you have this purification process. So this metaphor of fire. Over there in 1 Corinthians 3, just quickly, I want you to look at that. This is where Paul is talking about the benefits of some trials and those who have been converted. And some people, look there at verse 12. He says, he's talking about those who would teach and then those who would obey that message. But look, and he uses similar kind of figures here. Let's read verse 10. Let's read verse 10 through 15. 1 Corinthians 3, 10 through 15. Dino, can you get that for me? 1 Corinthians 3, 10 through 15.
1 Corinthians 3, 10 through 15.
Yes.
According to the grace of God, which is given unto me, as a wise master builder, I have laid the foundation of another builds therein. But let every man take heed how he builds thereupon. For other foundation can no man lay than is laid, which is Jesus Christ. Now if a man build up the foundation of gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, or stubble, every man's work shall be made manifest, for they shall declare, because it shall be revealed by fire, and the fire shall try every man's work of what sort it is. If any man's work abide, which he hath built thereupon, he shall receive the reward.
Okay, very good. Go ahead and get verse 15, I'm sorry.
If any man's work shall be burned, he shall suffer loss, but he himself shall be saved, if so as by fire.
Thank you. So let's look at this for a minute. So he describes those who would obey the gospel from his teaching or anyone's teaching. And when he describes them, look at verse 12. He says, now if any man builds on the foundation, now who has he already told you is the foundation? Jesus. Okay, there is no other foundation. But then, and he's been taught, if you go back up in the context, he uses the agricultural metaphors there. Now he's into architectural metaphors here. So earlier on, he talks about the fact that Paul says, I planted and who watered? Apollos. But then what does he say? But God gave the increase. Okay. Now he shifts more to kind of architectural language. He's like a building. And when he's talking about this, so you have a foundation, and as we teach, we lay on that foundation. Later on, he says, let's be careful how we build on that foundation. But then, there in verse 12, he describes gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, straw. What happens to wood, hay, and straw in a fire? Fast. Okay? But what's going to happen to gold? Well, you're going to have a purification process. It's going to last. It's going to be able to persevere and that kind of thing. So later on, and let me explain this, when he says that the work, he's talking about those who've obeyed the gospel, the work will be tested by what? Fire. The fire is described, whether he's talking about trials or the final day of judgment, doesn't really matter here as far as the application that I think we need to make. And that is that this work is, the nature, the quality of it is revealed by the test. Okay. So then he says in verse 14, if any man's work which he has built on it, that's the teacher, remains, it's gold and silver, he will receive a reward. He's not talking about degrees of reward in heaven, like some people try to interpret this. He's simply saying the reward, Paul would say about the Thessalonians, you are my joy and crown. And so what he's saying is there's a reward in seeing people grow in the kingdom and be faithful Christians. But sometimes that's not what happens. Sometimes we've done our best. We've taught the same thing we've taught to everybody else. What does verse 15 say sometimes happens? Yeah, sometimes it's wood, hay, stubble. People get burned up. And the person who has taught them, regardless of who that is, feels a sense of loss, but they're not going to lose their soul because somebody else is lost. But there's still there should be a sense of loss in that. And that's what he describes. But the test is described in terms of fire, fiery ordeal, fiery trials, that kind of thing. So when we come back to 1 Peter, he's using that same kind of language. So we shouldn't be surprised. This is going to happen. But then in verse 13, he says, even though that's happening, we can still rejoice in this. Verse 13, but to the degree that you share the sufferings of Christ, Keep on rejoicing, so that also at the revelation of the glory you may rejoice with exultation. So what is it in that verse that he gives as a foundation for our joy, for our rejoicing? There's at least a couple of things. Huh?
Share with Christ.
Yeah. So there's a fellowship with his sufferings. You know, Paul talks about that in Philippians 3, that he thanked God that he could have fellowship with Jesus in his sufferings. There's a connection between the Christ and his disciples in suffering. So when I'm suffering, sometimes we don't think of it that way, but when I'm suffering for righteousness' sake, I'm really, truly walking in the footsteps of Jesus. Okay? So there's that. And then, pointing forward, what does he say? Should cause me to rejoice in my sufferings.
Christ's glory.
Yeah, I believe in Christ's return. And 2 Thessalonians 1 speaks to that in verses 6 through 9, to people who were in tribulation. And he says, you know, remember, Jesus is going to come in flaming fire, taking vengeance on them that know not God and them that obey not the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ. But he goes on to say those who believe will be admiring him, and they will be admired. They'll be recognized, okay? So the two big things is, number one, when I'm suffering for righteousness' sake, I'm sharing with Jesus in what he did. I'm following in his footsteps, and there's joy in that. And then the other part of this is, I'm looking forward to the end, and I know that God will be faithful in his judgment, okay? So let's go to the next verse here. So verse 14, he says, if you are reviled for the name of Christ, and this is very similar to verse 13, you are blessed because the Spirit of glory and of God rest on you. So I'm walking in the footsteps of Jesus. I'm walking in the presence and fellowship of God. I'm looking forward to the return of Christ. And then in verse 15, though, he gives us a warning. What does it say in verse 15?
Don't suffer as a murderer or an evildoer.
Right. So it's not just any suffering that does all this. It's suffering for the gospel's sake. It's suffering for Christ's sake. Then in verse 16, but if any, in contrast to that, so he mentions, you know, as a murderer, evildoer, troublesome meddler, but if anyone suffers as a Christian, he is not to be ashamed. He's not ashamed of this. Now, the world thinks you should be ashamed, but he says you shouldn't be ashamed, but glorify God on this behalf or in this name. How many times do we see the word Christian in the New Testament? What'd you say? 3. Do you know where they are, Bo? Yes. Yes. Yep. So you would think it would be more than that, wouldn't you? But I mean, it's a beautiful description of a disciple of Jesus. But the name Christian is mentioned in at least those 3 places. Some will try to tell you that name just was given out of derision. That if you read, there's a section in Vine's dictionary that even says that, and I don't believe that. I mean, there may have been some derision involved with the name, but that's not the source of the name. If you go back to Isaiah, and he'll talk about God's people being given a new name, and if we read closely from Acts 11:26, they were called Christians first in Antioch. In that context, is talking about the action of the apostles under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. It says they, the apostles, assembled with them, those men who were inspired. They were teaching, these men that were inspired were teaching them, and then they were called Christians first in Antioch. So the ones doing the calling are the same ones who are doing the assembling, and they're the same ones who are doing the teaching. And nowhere in the Bible do we even have the implication that this was some name to be ashamed of, because Peter even says, don't be ashamed of it. Okay? Now, we're also called disciples or followers of Jesus. We're to be students of Christ. There's other, we're children of God. But it's interesting, this is one of those few places where he explicitly mentions it. Okay? All right. So that gets us to verses 17 through 19, which is pretty interesting. So let's look at this section. Verses 17 through 19, he says, for it is time for judgment to begin with the household of God. And if it begins with us first, what will be the outcome for those who do not obey the gospel of God? And if it is with difficulty that the righteous is saved, what will become of the godless man and the sinner? Therefore, those who also suffer according to the will of God shall entrust their souls to a faithful Creator in doing what is right. Now, this is one of those passages where you really have to observe those rules about Bible study we talk about a lot. So, in the immediate context, what has he been talking about? Yes, he's been talking about Christ, but what experience has he been talking about? Suffering. Okay, so suffering for Christ. And so now he has held up Jesus as a model at the beginning of chapter 4 to follow, chapter 2 to follow, but in what experience? Suffering. Okay, he's been talking about suffering. So there in we've just read it, verse 12, don't be surprised the fiery ordeal as though some strange thing happened to you. He has been talking about Christ being with us, but he's talking about suffering. Verse 14, if you're reviled for the name of Christ, you're blessed. What are we talking about? Suffering. Verse 15, make sure you don't suffer for the wrong reason. Verse 16, if anyone suffers as a Christian, he's not to be ashamed, but he's to glorify God in this name. Then we have verse 17, verse 18, verse 19. So let's talk a little bit about this passage, if I can get my clicker to... All right, so let me just kind of put all my cards out on the table here. I don't think he's saying, well, Christians are barely going to be saved and go to heaven. And if that's true about them, then what about people who aren't Christians? I've heard that actually applied that way, and I just don't think that's going to work. And fundamentally, if you go to a passage like 2 Peter 1, turn over to 2 Peter chapter 1, and we're talking about the same man, just in another epistle. Let's look at 2 Peter 1 when he talks about, adding virtue and knowledge, temperance, patience, godliness, brotherly kindness, and love, and these qualities be in you and abound, and they make you fruitful. But notice, let's read verse 10 and 11. Okay, so let's, Toby, if you would, read 2 Peter 1, verses 10 and 11. Notice this very closely.
Therefore, brethren, be all the more diligent to make certain about his calling and choosing you. For as long as you practice these things, you will never stumble. For in this way, the entrance into the eternal kingdom of the Lord and Savior Jesus Christ will be abundantly supplied to you.
Okay, thank you. So, when he talks about the eternal kingdom, he's talking about our heavenly reward. How does he say that's supplied to us? Abundantly. Okay, I don't think anybody barely gets into heaven. Okay, so that doesn't fit. We could look at a lot of other passages, but when you deal with the fact that, yes, we have responsibility to obey Christ and have faith, but we're saved by grace, I don't think God's grace barely gets us there. Okay? That's just not the hope that we have is one of, Jesus says, I give life and I give it more abundantly. He gives the abundant life. Okay. So when you understand that, even from Peter, even when you read 2 Peter 1, 10 and 11, you kind of go, okay, wait a minute. So what is he talking about at the end of chapter 4? So I think there's a different way of looking at this that makes more sense, at least to me. When you go back to 1 Peter 4, in the context of dealing with suffering, and you do have to put some time frame on this. You do have to understand when Peter is writing, there's the dispersion, there's already suffering, there's already persecution, but more is right around the corner, okay? So in the context of the fact that we have been dealing with suffering here, I think what he says, when he says, for it's time for judgment to begin, this testing is going to become more intense. For it's time for judgment to begin with the household of God. And if it begins with us first, what will be the outcome for those who do not obey the gospel of God? Verse 18, and if it is with difficulty that the righteous is saved, and it's important to understand that the word saved can be used in a lot of different ways. Sometimes, as we've talked about, it's our past salvation, our present salvation, future salvation, but sometimes saved is used in the sense of being delivered from something, Paul uses it that way in Philippians chapter 1. He talks about salvation. Well, there's a section there in Philippians 1 where he's not really talking about final salvation. What he's talking about is deliverance through a trial. Okay, there's a sense in which we have salvation or deliverance through a trial. And I think what Peter is saying is if this suffering that's coming on us, if it's even difficult for God's people to persevere under trial, okay, it's that difficult, then how are people who have no faith, who have no hope, going to be able to experience this or deal with this? And we've probably all had that thought before. I've heard people say before, it'd be hard to go through this if I wasn't a Christian. It'd be just so very difficult if with this suffering, if I wasn't a child of God and I didn't have the hope and the faith that I have. I think Peter's pretty much saying that. I think that's what he's saying. And therefore you don't have a contradiction. It's not that we barely stumble into heaven or anything like that. We're abundantly going to have this entrance into heaven. But I think what he's saying in the context of 1 Peter 4 is that when this suffering, just for them to understand, your faith is something you need to hang on to when you think about this suffering and how important it is and how intense this is going to be. Look at verse 19. Therefore, those also who suffer according to the will of God. See, that's the context. Those who suffer according to the will of God shall entrust their souls to a faithful Creator in doing what is right. And so as difficult as this is, as a Christian, I've entrusted my soul, I've committed my soul to a Creator who I know is going to do what is right. How is somebody who's rebellious to God going to handle this? Not very well. Okay? So to me, that's just my viewpoint. You may have a different one, but I think that fits with the context, harmonizes with everything Peter says, and doesn't set up any contradictions. If anybody wants to take issue with that, shoot, go ahead. Go ahead, Alan.
Well, I don't want to take issue with it, but I do think oftentimes there's a dual fulfillment.
Mm-hmm.
So the destruction of Jerusalem, for instance, has some imagery or foreshadowing of the final judgment, destruction of the earth and all.
Mm-hmm.
So I think in some sense this may have some application to that as well. Not that we barely get through, but that apart from Christ,
yes, that'd be fair. Yeah.
None of us have any hope without Christ.
Right.
So I just think there may be some broad application in that standpoint too.
Right. I'll think. Well, I agree with you on the kind of, we've talked about that before, the double kind of, I don't know if I'd say double fulfillment, but I guess that's what I'd say. You have the immediate fulfillment and then the more extended. That clearly would be the case with our sufferings here. With their suffering, we're not going to go through the destruction of Jerusalem, but we have sufferings that we're going to go through. And it is true that without Christ, none of us would have any hope. And it's also true that even with Christ, living in this world is a difficult thing, even for believers. So then you talk about those who aren't believers, who have no hope. And Paul says that in 1 Corinthians 15, if in this life only we have hope in Christ, we are of all men most pitiable, if we didn't have Christ. So, yeah, I can see that. I do think the primary application has to do with suffering here in this context, but there may be an extended application. Go ahead, Calvin. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And it indicates with trial, with challenge. Sure. Okay, go ahead. Go ahead.
This is pretty much along the same lines, but talking about it being difficult with righteousness to save it, and that doesn't mean, like you said, that you can barely get by, maybe, but there are a lot of people that will appear to be righteous, and then when trials do come and they're severe, grace.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's the difficult part, the ones that you have to remain steadfast
Right.
through the trial.
Right.
That's pretty much what everybody said.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, let's go on into, there's one thing I want to mention. It's interesting in 1 Peter 2, verses 21 through 25. Remember when we noticed that? If you compare that to verse 19 of 1 Peter 4, in 1 Peter 4:19, he said, those who suffer according to the will of God shall entrust their souls to a faithful Creator in doing what is right. If you go back to 1 Peter 2 and you look at that example of Jesus, verse 21, for you have been called for the purpose since Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example for you to follow in his steps, who committed no sin, nor was any deceit found in his mouth. And while being reviled, he did not revile in return. While suffering, he uttered no threats. Notice this, but kept entrusting himself to him who judges righteously. So basically, we're told to do what Jesus did in his suffering. And so he would be the example we would need to follow. Okay? Does anybody else have a comment on that? Anybody? Okay. All right, let's get into 1 Peter chapter 5 in the time that we have left. And we won't have time to finish all of this, but we are going to get into it. So let's read 1 Peter 5. He shifts a little bit, but he's still talking about our relationship. And he's going to talk about shepherds and the flock and that kind of thing. And then more generally about submission to one another. And then he'll talk about temptation and overcoming the wicked one. So let's look at 1 Peter 5, verses 1 through 4. Alan, would you mind reading that, please?
Therefore I exhort the elders among you as your fellow elder and witness the sufferings of Christ, and a partaker also of the glory that is to be revealed. Shepherd the flock of God among you, exercising oversight, not under compulsion, but voluntarily, according to the will of God, not for sporting gain, but with eagerness. Nor yet as lording it over those allotted to your charge, but proving to be examples to the flock. When the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the eternal glory.
Okay, let's look here at verse 1. He mentions, what terms do you see or work do you see associated with this particular function? So he mentions, I exhort the elders among you. But then what else does he say? Go down to verse 2. Shepherds. So even in this context, you have these different designations. And sometimes people get confused by that. It's very common for people to think of the preacher as being a pastor regardless. Our Mormon friends, I met a young man that was a, quote, Mormon elder, and he wasn't married and he didn't have any kids. And, so in the religious world, it's kind of like people just grab these designations. Sometimes they make distinctions. If you look at Roman Catholicism, you'll have a lot of distinctions made in some of these particular designations and that sort of thing. There are 6 words that have to do with the work of overseeing or elders. We have 2 concepts here, but do we know I've got it up. No, I didn't put it up there. Okay, so we'll have to think this morning. I've got it on the next slide, but I don't want you to cheat. So there's 6 words. There's 6 words here. There's kind of 3 pairs, all right? So the pairs of terms emphasize, like you'll have one pair and that emphasizes one aspect of the work. You have another pair and it emphasizes another aspect. So y'all try to help me here. There's 6 terms. So we know elder, and what would go with elder, maybe? Well, yeah, no. One it'll be the last one presbyter. It's the last one everybody remembers. So elder and presbyter, and we have elders from time to time. Acts chapter 14, verse 23, Titus 1 and verse 5. But we also have presbyter, which is one who's more mature, that's exerting this oversight. And by mature in the faith, etc. Okay? Let me do it this way. What goes with overseer? What term? Bishop. Yeah, so bishop. and overseer kind of go together. And both of those terms, if you were to look those up, we can see overseer in Acts 20 and verse 28. Philippians 1 and verse 1 mentions bishop. 1 Timothy 3:1 actually mentions bishop, qualifications of elders. And what does that, well, overseer gives you an idea. It's one who has some superintendency, some authority and leading in that way. But then we have this other pair of terms, which we're probably more familiar with. Pastor and shepherd go together. So we have presbyter, elder, we have bishop and overseer, we have pastor and shepherd. When you go through the New Testament, they're not describing different works. Okay, they're describing the same work, different aspects of that work. There's a shepherding sense, and that's what Peter's really emphasizing here. There's an overseeing sense. When you think about those who serve in this capacity, there's also hopefully maturity and discernment in spiritual areas. So anyway, I just want to make that clear since we're right here. Ephesians 4:11 and 12 uses pastors. Pastors actually used pretty sparingly in the New Testament. Shepherds and elders seem to be some of the common, and bishops seems to be common ways of describing it. So when you think about this, and we think about elders, so these are our phrases here, and there are some passages that would go with that. And then again, these are various terms that emphasize different aspects of the same work: to guard, to defend, to oversee, to guide, to protect, to care for the flock of God that's entrusted to them, for which they'll give judgment will come upon them. Okay, anybody have a comment or question about any of that? All right. Oh,
Just one thought.
Okay, go ahead.
Kind of, you think of shepherd, pastor, the term pasture, just to help you remember that, think about the sheep in the pasture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, I think that's where that term comes from.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the connection there.
Right. To care for that flock. Yeah, that's a good point. Okay, so we're studying 1 Peter 5. Notice there's a phrase, and we'll kind of end here and pick up next week. But in 1 Peter 5, he says, "Therefore I exhort the elders among you as your fellow elder." So Peter was an elder. He says fellow elder. "And witness of the sufferings of Christ, and a partaker also of the glory that is to be revealed. Shepherd the flock of God among you, exercising oversight, not under compulsion, but voluntarily according to the will of God, and not for sordid gain, but with eagerness, nor yet as lording it over those allotted to your charge, but proving to be examples of the flock." So you'll notice there in verse 1, "Therefore I exhort the elders among you," okay? But then when you come to verse 2, he tells the shepherds, "Shepherd the flock among you." Well, you could read over that and not think about it, but that's very important. What are some implications of that? To say, "Shepherd the flock which is among you." What'd you say? Yeah, I mean, the shepherds would be dealing in an autonomous way with that flock, not another flock. So you wouldn't have multiple flocks under one group of elders. Any arrangement like that is not fitting the New Testament pattern. Okay, so the elders that have been appointed by any given congregation oversee that flock, but they don't oversee another flock. They don't have authority over another flock. Okay? So there's that truth. Go ahead.
You also have to know, the elders have to know who is among their flock.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the reason, attend a congregation and go for years and years and years and not place membership.
Yeah.
They're not, are they part of the flock?
Or not. Yeah, that's right. And so just let me hit this slide and then we'll stop here. So shepherds are to care for the flock which is allotted to their charge or which is among you. Elders are not to oversee multiple churches, but they are to pastor the brethren, again, which is among you. Any arrangement which infringes on those principles violates the New Testament pattern. And it is important to note that the example we have in Scripture is never of a singular elder. There's a plurality of men, and that makes a whole lot of common sense. So we'll stop there. We'll pick up there next Sunday. Thank you.